to the top. I won gold at the Paralympic Games. There's no higher place to go. What do I do now? And it's amazing how that moment of being on the podium and that moment of winning and singing my national anthem lasted about 30 seconds. It didn't even sink in that I'd won, and I wasn't really happy about that. I was more worried about what was coming next.
And our next guest is none other than former professional athlete Susie Rodgers, a British Paralympic swimmer who competed at 2 Paralympic Games, winning a total of 30 international medals, including 17 gold medals. Of course, one of which was the iconic gold win in the women's S7 classification 50 meters butterfly at the Rio 2016 Paralympic Games. She set an European record of 35.07 seconds, and her shocked expression and reaction became a media highlight of the Games. Susie conducted her entire career as an athlete while still maintaining her professional career with a part-time role at the British Council as well as sitting on various boards. Today, Susie continues to be an advocate for inclusion and diversity, showing what is possible through openly speaking about her own experiences as a disabled woman who grew up wearing prosthetics on her left arm and orthotics for her right foot. From advising international development charities on inclusion to protecting our oceans as World Economic Forum Young Global Leader and as Ocean Ambassador for the Marine Conservation Society, Susie has been making billion-dollar moves with her fierce resilience and competitive spirit. You don't want to miss this. Welcome to Billion Dollar Moves, the show for the top US and Asia founders, funders, and execs. From the growing pains of a unicorn journey to IPO, scaling a venture capital firm, and the shift of wealth, we cover it all. Good afternoon, everyone. It is such a pleasure to be back here.
I'm in rainy and slightly cold London, but yeah, it's really lovely to be here with you. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks, Susie. And as spoken in the prelude earlier, I typically spend time with CEOs speaking about, their leadership style and things like that. But of course, as an athlete yourself, all sort of the connecting ties is really about high performance and how we become and tap into our best selves. And as our friend Greg would say, in an effortless way. And really want to speak about that in this episode with you. You started your career a little bit later after university. You were on the swim team and things like that. But how does someone transition from, I like swimming, to I'm going to win, and actually, you know what? I'm going all the way to gold at the end of it.
It happened quite organically. I mean, I wouldn't say that I was the kind of athlete that at the age of 6 said, Mummy and Daddy, I want to be a Paralympic gold medalist. It sort of, I kind of found sport in a kind of unusual journey. And part of the way I found sport was actually really for social connection. When I was at university, I've always been a swimmer, and I love swimming, and I knew I was good at swimming, but I don't think I really got a lot of encouragement at school. I mean, certainly I never had, talent ID at school, people saying, you're really, really good. It was at university, which I know you call school. It's a different way of saying it. But yeah, at university, I was feeling a bit isolated, really. I left home. And I guess I was looking for that connection, and I thought about joining the university club and being part of that. But actually, I wanted to experience what it was like to be in kind of disability competitions, because I'd always really competed against non-disabled people. I was very much inspired around watching Beijing in 2008, and then we'd also won the bid to host the Games in the UK, in London. That was announced in 2005. And at that point, I was graduating from university, and I was thinking, what am I going to do? And I was working, but thinking, there's an opportunity here, home games, which is everybody's dream, to compete in front of a home crowd. But the whole time I was swimming, and I was using it as a way to connect with people. So it was definitely a hobby that I knew I was good at, but kind of then led me in this direction. The lesson I've learned from that is that you know, you follow what you enjoy and you follow what you love, and somehow it can lead you to some really interesting, amazing places.
If I may, you mentioned something there that I want to dive a little bit deeper on. You talked about the transition of competing with non-disabled, and then transitioning to then think maybe I want to join and connect with this community. And, framing it from the perspective of many of us who sometimes feel inferior, right? And of course, we can't even imagine sort of your life and your lived experience. It's interesting that you said, I wanted to compete with people like me in some way. Tell us a little bit about that sort of mental model and thought process there.
Well, I suppose there's two aspects to that. One of them is the way I was brought up. So, you know, I was born with my disability. I was born missing the lower part of my left leg and the lower part of my left arm, and some kind of malformations of my right leg and foot. So I was born, my parents didn't know that there was anything wrong. Nothing was picked up in scans. And then, you know, suddenly I arrived, and it was, you know, quite a shock for them. And I think, you know, from the word go, my parents are extremely practical people, and very much, you know, this is what we're dealing with and we just get on with it. And so I was brought up to be told, you know, you are equal to everybody else, and you just have to adapt things and work around things. So I suppose most of my upbringing was spent outside of the disability community, and very much in a mainstream environment. And I guess at some point, it kind of struck me, because there's pros and cons to that, really. And I'm sure my parents would agree, because it struck me at times like, why is this so challenging? And how come I can't really relate to anybody about this? And, you know, and why are there so many barriers there? And why is it so complicated to do, you know, just things that people take for granted? So there was that aspect of it, of wanting to reconnect with a community and to meet people who I knew I could relate to in many ways and talk about experiences with, and, you know, that kind of thing. But equally, or that dimension of actually, not that I was racing against non-disabled people and losing, because sometimes I would actually be winning, but more but more so to see where I sat or where I was positioned within the, you know, the Paralympic swimming movement. And that was something that intrigued me, because I'm obviously a decent swimmer, because I can basically train with people with 2 arms and 2 legs and be able to keep up with them. So what would happen if I then raced against people who were technically of a similar disability to me? What would happen? So there were 2 aspects to it, really.
Wow, that's interesting. And you decided to, you know, take that even further and bring that to competitive level, sort of at an international level. Talk to us a little bit about sort of that transition. I mean, you said you were also working, right? You were sort of like working and swimming at the same time. When did you know, and this is what I'm getting at, when do you know what you love is sort of that Ikigai, right? That this is what you can, you know, really do well in the world with what you love, and it's sort of that sweet spot in the Venn diagram to really take it to the next level.
It's really hard to reflect on yourself and try and see, you know, or at least say, right, what is it that I'm really good at? And I think people find that really hard to do. I find it hard to do even now that I've kind of transitioned out of sport. I think really sitting down and thinking about, what am I good at, but equally, what are my values? What do I want to do? What do I feel passionate about? Where do I think I can have impact? Where am I going to get that buzz that makes me feel really good? And I think with the swimming, it wasn't necessarily a buzz or, oh, I know I'm really good at this. It was a natural fit. It's like, you know, putting on a pair of comfortable shoes and feeling like you know what you're doing, you're confident to do it, and you can do it well. And I think all of those things combined just kind of build up and can take you in that direction. And, you know, I still get that realization when I'm at work and I realize there's something that I know that I'm good at doing, and I know that I can do it well. And I think it's enhancing those strengths that you have, because I think a lot of people think that they need to focus on the weaknesses, try and build up their weaknesses. But I've heard a lot of people also say, well, just, you know, look at your strengths and really amplify them and bring them to the table. I knew I was good at competing and I enjoyed training. I think that's probably the biggest thing about being an athlete, is if you actually go in and you enjoy getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning and going into a cold pool and swimming up and down, backwards and forwards constantly. If you're really, really happy doing that and you enjoy it, then great. And I just love pushing my body. I love the idea of taking my body to the limits of what it can do, not past the limits. I mean, sometimes I did do that, and that was where I wasn't very good at training. I never knew when to kind of stop and give myself time to recover. But I think knowing what you can push yourself to do and your limits, and testing those limits, and having a kind of a no fear approach is definitely goes part and parcel with being an athlete.
You decide to do this competitively, and I know you talk about how everything was organic, but for, I guess, non-athletes like ourselves, the many of us tuning in who don't exactly understand the world of Olympians and Paralympians, how do you even get to that level of, do you get scouted and then you get identified and then you train?
It depends on which country you're in as to the system and how it works with recognition. But what you do is you go to national level competitions and you compete at national level. So you're kind of on that radar. And once you're on that radar, they're watching your times coming down, your personal best times go down. And if you're improving rapidly enough, and they can look at your rankings in the world and they can see that you're improving incrementally and it's happening in a fast rate, then that's when you get talent spotted. And you start to get more support. You get someone that will come and give you advice. But actually, to be honest with you, most of it I did myself, because I was very much outside of the system until I was very much on the system. I really only got put on funding when I actually went to a European Championships and I came away with 5 gold medals. And then they were like, oh, I think we should put her on funding now. But I'd literally worked full time, and I'd been training myself to get to that level, and I'd basically funded it all.
What's been clear, Susie, is and I've known you to be so determined in that you've sort of been very clear that you are driving your career and shaping that with a lot of intentionality and building that. What were some of the lessons that you've sort of, if you, I mean, hindsight's always 2020, but if you look upon your time as an athlete, what were some of the best decisions that you made?
Was to keep control of my own career as an athlete. We have setups in the UK where you can go and join what they call a performance centre, which means you completely relocate, you go and move yourself to be in a certain place where all of the other athletes train on the national team, and you get everything. You get nutrition, you get psychology, you get all of that support. I decided not to. I decided to stay with my coach that I'd met, and with Keith, who I'd worked with for many years. There were times when I did back and forth on that decision and think maybe I should move there, maybe it would be easier, I would be with the team regularly, kind of from a motivational perspective. But I, in hindsight, don't regret it one bit, because I'm the kind of person that is proactive, and I do, which is very kind of you to say that determination, but it's something that's in me to have that ownership of my journey and as an athlete, and to feel like if something goes wrong, it's on me, And I say that in the sense that you have a team that work around you. You have your coaches, you have your support team, but ultimately it's you. You want to turn around and say to them, oh, well, that didn't work out because of you. Everything was on me in terms of whether I won or whether I came second, third, fourth, anything else. So, yeah, I think that's it, really. It's that ownership.
Absolutely love that. And you talked a little bit about sort of, what they provide you as you enter sort of the radar and you're within the group of athletes that are being trained, one of it being psychology, and of course, mental health, mental fitness, being an athlete, the tremendous amount of pressure just being watched, right, by everyone around the world. And of course, we've seen this recently with Simone Biles, with Naomi Osaka coming out. Of course, again, we've had two sides of the coin, right? The international community, I've even tuned into broadcasters saying, this is setting a bad example, because it's, you're being paid, you're being set to a task, and you're just going to back out like that because emotionally you can't handle yourself. What is your response to this? And talk to us a little bit about the mental health aspect of being an athlete.
I don't know how you can kind of judge judge somebody else's own mental health when you can't get inside someone's head. So when people comment on that, I think, maybe think in a more kind of human and kind and empathetic way. With mental health, it's very difficult because when you're an athlete and I used to perform, you feel like a performer. It does feel like you're going onto a stage when you're at that level of Olympic and Paralympic level. And, you're not really prepared for that because it's not like we are performers, but we're not given the kind of support that maybe an actor might get, about what to expect from the media. You get some very basic media training. You get a little bit of psychology, but it's usually about how to cope on race day and how to get the best performance out of yourself. I think it is woefully under-supported in sport, that support that athletes should get around mental health. I don't think there's enough, and there certainly isn't enough when you retire. You get absolutely nothing. You go from being on a stage in front of 17,500 people, which is how many were watching when I raced in London. And then, you're on TV in front of millions of people, and then suddenly you're nobody. I mean, if you have a media profile like Simone Biles, you might still get that media attention. But I was probably less well known, and you do literally get dropped. And you have to really navigate that yourself. And I found that transition very, very, very tough. I felt very isolated, very alone. Nobody really reached out, even fellow athletes that carry on, because they're carrying on in that journey and they're in that bubble of an athlete, of that athlete world, they don't understand what you're going through. You can't talk to them about it. I think certainly, I hit a point this year when I knew the Tokyo Games were coming, but also I was in lockdown and I had been very isolated because of COVID, where I thought I need to reach out. I need to get some help. And, we're very lucky here. We have in the UK, the National Health Service, and I reached out and asked for some support. And I was referred to a cognitive behavioral therapist, and I worked with her, and happily it fell over the time of the Paralympic Games period. And I really needed that, and it was absolutely pivotal and quite transformative because I'd never been offered anything like that as an athlete. And it was so valuable to kind of process that transition, process this new journey and this new phase of my life, let go of the old athlete me, and to kind of move on from that identity of being an athlete, and to realize that I have a lot to offer, not just being a Paralympic athlete.
It's interesting that what you're getting at with regards to that identity, right? And many of us, professionals, a lot of the audience of Billion Dollar Moves are high-powered executives. We've had CEOs of unicorns and sold their companies for close to $1 billion, things like that. And then many of them, of course, and I include myself in this, where we tie our career to our identity, right? The usual question is, who are you? What do you do? How do you think about identity today, and sort of how have you emerged from that transition in associating identity and self?
Imagine if you've set up a $1 billion company, right? Or you've set up something and it's done very well. It really is very similar to that journey as an athlete, because you plan, you're working towards a goal of whatever it is, or, selling your business or creating it or getting to a certain target and leading it through. And I talked about the importance of me taking ownership and responsibility for the successes or the failures, and the team that I bring around me. And it's exactly the same when you're leading a business. And I think, it's a difficult one, because when you've got to that point of achievement, and I'm sure that probably a lot of your listeners will be very perfectionist tendencies, highly driven, highly motivated, extremely proactive. Again, a lot of the things that I would identify with. You then have this label next to you of, social entrepreneur, or award winner, or XYZ that you've ticked. And then the inevitable thing is, right, what next? What do I do now? Where do I go? And I think that's something I experienced, because I was like, well, I got to the top, I won gold at the Paralympic Games, there's no higher place to go. What do I do now? And it's amazing how that moment of being on the podium and that moment of winning and singing my national anthem lasted about 30 seconds or however long it was, however long the national anthem is. I don't know how long it is. Someone will have to tell me that. But, you know, it lasted a very short amount of time. The medal hanging around my neck. Yes, there are moments afterwards. But, you know, if you were to say, well, that's it, you've achieved everything, you must feel great now. I mean, you know, it's ironic because I wouldn't say it's necessarily opens the door to, you know, working out how the world works. Oh, I've won a gold medal, so that's it, you know? Not at all. I mean, it's just part of the journey of life, isn't it? And I suppose you see it as stages leading you in the direction. And I think it's the same thing with business is, you know, it's taking stock of that achievement and always being, you know, as perfectionists, people can often tend to not pat themselves on the back for an achievement. I think you have to, for many years, it didn't even sink in that I'd won, and I wasn't really happy about that. I was more worried about what was coming next. And I think, you know, to get to that point where you take hold of where you are and say, no, that was an incredible achievement. Look at what I've done. Look at what I've achieved. And to use that, the good and the bad in that journey of getting you to that point, learning from that and going over that is so valuable. And I look back on my journey and mostly I don't focus on that winning moment. I focus on all of the little bits that got me to that point and how those can take me forward into the next phase of my life. And also it's okay to step back and say, you don't have to achieve constantly and you don't have to be winning awards all the time to enjoy life and to make the most of those simple moments. And I think COVID should have taught us that. Surely, you know, we're all, you know, locked down and isolated. And so we have to be faced with the reality of who we are and accept that, you know, we don't have to always be out there frantically doing everything, flying all over the world. You know, we can just take a moment to breathe. And I think that's, you know, a key thing to think about.
Yeah. And I love how you pointed out about how you yourself were anxious. You weren't enjoying it's always what next, right? You weren't exactly enjoying the win. You were focused on what next and what next and what next. So I mean, you know, you've been great in transitioning into helping so many others in your similar position and beyond through the international development work that you're doing. How did you find yourself to say, okay, this is next in my chapter? Did you give yourself a couple of years to try different things, or how did you find that?
Yeah, I did. I tried a few things. I moved jobs a couple of times. I moved sectors to find where I was fitting or where I could have impact. And I realized that I wanted to kind of give back and try and make impact that wasn't just about me winning. You know, it was about trying to change a narrative and not necessarily in an activist way, but in a, you know, I want to be in a mainstream environment, changing attitudes towards disability from within that environment. And so, you know, this opportunity came up to work on international development, and I first worked in economic development, so looking at investments into you know, so-called developing countries and low and middle income countries, and seeing how they could be more inclusive of people with disabilities, you know, through employment, through, you know, policies and strategies and so on. And then an opportunity came up to work in global health, which is obviously extremely topical right now. And, you know, the health sector, there's been some massive shocking data out there and evidence around, you know, the disproportionate impact on people with disabilities around COVID-19 in terms of direct impacts, but also indirect through lack of access to essential facilities and services that people would normally be able to access but couldn't during lockdowns. And I think that really inspired me to feel like I wanted to do something in that space and to support that work a little bit more. So yeah, it's kind of incredibly rewarding and very important work. But I definitely see myself as someone who can make an impact through starting conversations and challenging ideas, but also not in a kind of complaining or shouting way, but more in a kind of collaborative way, and bringing people to understand the why and the why it's so important and the how we can take it forward, really.
Yeah, and talk to us a little bit. I mean, I speak for myself in that, I have very little knowledge, beyond conversations with Kelly and yourselves in terms of the multi-trillion industry, so much development going around the world, and what corporations, organizations are working towards to enable access and to really mainstream almost the conversation, right, between the disabled and the not disabled. Talk to us a little bit about what we're seeing here from a landscape perspective for the
Yeah,
opportunity.
I mean, there's a huge opportunity because I think there's an assumption. I mean, well, if I go back to basics,
Mm,
people with disabilities really are disabled because of the structures in society that we have, which are basically unfair and create inequality. So, when we look at barriers for people, they could be physical barriers like access to a building. They could be attitudinal barriers, like someone assumes that someone with a disability might not have any money and therefore might not want to buy their own possessions and things, silly things
mm,
like that. But just at a kind of basic level, there's communication barriers, there's institutional barriers, there's so many barriers that are there within society, and it's more the fault of society for not supporting or enabling people with disabilities to be part of that. And that's why we need to be part of the conversation, because very often someone might say, well, you need to do this or you need to change this. But actually, if you talk to the person with the disability, they are probably best placed to know what they might need or what might be useful for them. And I think very much in the kind of consumer space, a lot of companies don't really consult with people with disabilities to understand how products can be adapted very simply, or to make them more accessible for people with a visual impairment or a hearing impairment. So I think there is more of an awareness out there, and it's growing, and there's definitely more being done in this space. But I think there's still a long way to go. And when I think about the health sector, for example, there's a huge amount to be done around, basic collection of data in a lot of countries. People with disabilities
mm.
aren't even counted in some places. So it's looking around census data, and making sure that employees are creating an open culture where people can talk about disability. They're not afraid to discuss that in a conversation, but also even looking at senior leadership. I mean, how many leaders out there would or have a disability, would identify as having a disability, and would talk about it openly without fear of judgment? So there's so many different areas that we could talk on a whole other program about.
Well, we've covered quite a lot of ground here, and this is a short program, but I think we've covered good ground, and now we transition into sort of the quick rapid fire, million
Oh,
dollar questions, 8 quick questions, and your first thing that comes to mind. Are you ready, Susie?
I am ready.
Always rating. Good. This might be obvious, but what's your highest high?
I think winning gold, but I think my highest high was actually when I won gold at the World Championships in a team. It was in a relay event, and I was coming off the back of being injured and ill, and I swam the last leg of the race, and I managed to hold on to the win, and I did it for the girls. I didn't do it for me because I was really poorly and quite in pain, but it was probably the best race I've ever done, second to my
Wow.
obviously winning in Rio.
Lowest low.
Earlier this year, it was really tough when I was in lockdown, isolated, feeling quite like I was disconnected from the sport community, and knowing that the games was coming up and I wouldn't really be a huge part of it. I think that was probably a pretty low point.
When you think of the word successful, who do you think of and why?
I kind of would say that I think successful people aren't necessarily people that are rich or who have achieved a lot, but are actually content within themselves and and they don't look back at their life with any regrets, but just look at everything as a kind of learning journey. I'd say possibly my mum has managed to do that quite well. She's sort of navigated a lot in her life and steered me to be quite an independent person and gave me a lot of strength. And I think the one thing I would say is that she's someone that, doesn't rate achievement over just being content and comfortable within who you are, which I think is quite a skill, really. Yeah.
Wow. Wow. Worst advice that you've been given?
when I was kind of not allowed to take part in sport, and the PE teachers would just sort of they just kind of sat me in the library because they didn't really know what to do with me. I wouldn't say that's necessarily advice, but it's still bad that there wasn't that opportunity to really pursue my athletic talents from an early age, I guess. Yeah.
Well, it's that they also chose to sit you out rather than find a way with you, right?
Yeah, I guess because there was an assumption that because I had a disability and they weren't aware of options for me that I couldn't do sport, you know.
Yeah. Wow. Most important or hardest lesson you've had to learn?
Probably that not everyone will like you, because I'm a bit of a people pleaser, and I think you've got to realize that not everyone will agree with you, not everyone will like you, but you have to be okay with that and be comfortable with your own decisions and who you are and be strong in that. So yeah.
Favorite tool or hack for productivity?
Mindfulness, 100%. Yeah. Visualization as well. So kind of rehearsing things, thinking through things, but also emptying your mind and just being in the now.
Finally, for those that have been in the rough, as you have, that are going through some of the hard things moving forward, whether that's an entrepreneurship, whether they're scaling their businesses, what's your number one takeaway that you want them to have?
Well, I mean, this is taken directly from a kind of a self-help book, but I can't remember the name of the author. So there you go, another book that's good. But basically, feel the fear and do it anyway. I can't remember the author, but she definitely does exist. But it's definitely just don't be afraid. Don't worry if things go wrong. Don't be afraid of failure. It's not failure, it's learning. You'll just learn from it. As long as you learn from things, it doesn't matter. And just don't give up. I mean, I think the one thing in my career as an athlete, there were times when I could have given up and walked away and said, that's enough, I'm done. But I think there's that little bit of instinct and that little bit of something inside of you that tells you to keep going. So listen to your intuition, and you'll know when it's time to walk away.
Susie, that was wonderful. Thank you so much for your time,
That's no
for
problem.
sharing. I mean, everything that you've been through, and it is truly remarkable. Sometimes, we in our lives, we say we're not good enough, we complain, things like that. But just seeing someone like you just feel the fear and do it anyway, just
That
gives us
isn't that
so much
isn't my
inspiration.
phrase. It's definitely not my phrase. So I don't want to take copyright credit for that one. But no, it is a good idea though. And that's
well, it is a good idea, and important than the idea is that you show us by example. So Susie, thank you so much for your time, and we are so excited to continue to see you thrive in your next few chapters in life, and hopefully I'll see you soon, Susie, and give you hugs.
Thank you for having me, Sarah. Thanks so much.